Okay, hello everyone, Salam alaikum, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our exclusive Insights webinar on pursuing business opportunities and managing financial crime risks in Saudi Arabia. For those of you that don't already know me, my name is Florence Durham-Ball. I am an advisory consultant in the regional financial crime practice of Al-Tamimi & Company, and I have the pleasure of moderating the discussion today, so I'll do my very best to steer us through at least most of the most relevant points, although of course there's so much to talk about when it comes to Saudi Arabia. I'm joined today by two of our partners who hardly need any introduction. Ibtisam Laswed, Head of Advisory in the Regional Financial Crime Practice, and Hisham Hamoud, who is partner in our Corporate Structuring and Corporate Commercial Practice in Riyadh. Good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon and salam alaikum everyone. It's great to be here in person in Riyadh with you and Hisham. And yes, as funny as it looks, I did travel physically to attend a virtual webinar, but hopefully next time our guests will be able to join us in person, inshallah.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our webinar, and welcome to Florence and Ibtisam in Riyadh, KSA.
Thank you, both of you. So before we launch into the heart of our discussion, I just have two very quick housekeeping points. If all goes to plan, we will have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you do have any queries throughout the webinar, feel free to post those either in the questions box on Zoom or in the comments section. Secondly, we're not expecting any technical issues, but if for any reason we do become disconnected, you can rejoin using the same link as we did before. So you've probably noticed our beautiful setting today. We are fortunate enough to be in one of the majlises at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. And aside from the obvious benefits of such a beautiful location, our choice of venue today was also symbolic. In the same way that the Ritz-Carlton has played host to many of Saudi Arabia's international conferences, including the Future Investment Initiative or Davos in the Desert, Riyadh is fast becoming a destination for international businesses, capital, and attention from the world over. In the few short years since the announcement of Vision 2030 by His Highness the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the glittering picture of Saudi Arabia's future has been brought much closer to reality, featuring an open international economy, world-leading healthcare, infrastructure and education, and of course, sustainable human development. The scale of Saudi Arabia's ambition is evident in its plans and is captured in the numbers. According to the Crown Prince, the kingdom will spend more in the next 10 years than it has in the past 300. Between government spending, private investment, and domestic consumption, a projected 27 trillion Saudi riyals in total will be pumped into the Saudi market by 2030, fueling job creation, market diversification, and of course, a higher standard of living. But with the transformation in Saudi Arabia's market conditions, there comes a corresponding shift in financial crime risks in response to increased interaction between the public and the private sectors and the increase in the cross-border flow of funds. Both sides of this dyad in development have been shaped by legislative change, as the Saudi authorities are using the law to both fuel economic modernization and preemptively protect against the criminal abuse. So this is the key dynamic that we're hoping to shed some light on today, drawing on some of the queries that we face from our clients and also our own experience in the market. So Hisham, I'll start with a high-level question for you, if that's okay, just so that you can give us some context. What are the main changes to commercial law in Saudi Arabia that are driving market transformation?
Thanks, Florence. I think it is difficult. Within a few minutes, you can outline all of the changes in the commercial law in Saudi Arabia. May I start with one thing? I would say that there is no commercial law per se in Saudi as you may find it in other jurisdictions, rather than it's a combination of laws and regulations that govern various sectors of commercial activities. As a corporate lawyer dealing with governmental authorities and business enterprises in general, I see as everyone a tremendous changes in the law, in the laws in general in Saudi. I mean, for example, during the last 5 years, there was more than 60 laws and regulations has been enacted or has been updated to cope with the best practice in the world. There was a totally new bankruptcy law, commercial mortgage law, and we are expecting later this year there will be 4 major law will be enacted. I'm referring specifically to the personal status law, to the law of enforcement, to the law of evidence, penal code for discretionary sanctions, and civil transactions law. These new laws certainly will create more stability, raise the level of integrity, remove discrepancies, and provide a proper system of checks and balances. Going back to the commercial law specifically and the business environment in general, if I compare the requirements, the current requirements of doing business in Saudi with 10 years ago, you see a huge difference, a huge reduction of the requirements. There is something called the negative list. The negative list is referring to a list of activities that are restricted only for Saudi nationals. This list has been reduced, to make it just for a few type of activities. One of the main points I want to mention about the commercial law in general changes. It is expected that later this year, the government will announce the opening of around 20 free zones in the kingdom. 6 out of them will be in Riyadh only. The main purpose of these free zones is not to transfer the current businesses into these free zones, rather than open a new area of investment, attracting a key multinational key players into the kingdom. As you can see in these announcements from the government, they are expecting that there will be more development in certain areas of business, for example, biochemistry, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and perhaps more focus in the health industry in general. That's what I think what will come during the next few months, inshallah.
Okay, thank you, Hisham. I think that gives us a really good sense of exactly how broad the legislative reform has been and how broad we can expect it to be in the future as well in the coming months. So it makes sense if we do a parallel exercise with you then. The changes that are arising in the KSA market as a result of the legislative changes that Hisham are talking about, how do these features in a commercial market typically impact financial crime risks?
Well, if we are looking at this from a macro perspective, essentially what we are talking about is a complete transformation in the way that money moves in Saudi Arabia. So of course, this sounds like an obvious statement, but I'm not trying to be obtuse here. What we have seen in the past is very much a domestic market for Saudi Arabia. What I mean by this is that due to the nature of the sectors and the economic activity, the flows of funds were concentrated within Saudi Arabia's borders. So from a financial crime perspective, this acts as a significant mitigating factor against certain types of white-collar crime, particularly when it comes to money laundering and sanctions evasions, which relies, as you know, on the movement of money across borders to actually conceal the full payment chain, including the source of funds and the ultimate beneficiary. So this is not to say that Saudi Arabia was devoid of financial crime risk, of course. Addressing its legacy issues with counterterrorism financing has been a matter of serious priority for the Saudi government, one that has been also well documented publicly. And then if you look at fraud or embezzlement risks, they are present in every market ultimately. So I think that it's important to mention that Saudi Arabia's ambitions to become global frontrunner for business, finance, tourism, healthcare, and so many other metrics fundamentally changes the size, but also the shape of financial flows. By necessity, Saudi Arabia's borders are going to need to be more porous, both to money and to people. That also will create a certain transience that is much more open to exploitation by criminals. And evidence of this increase is already apparent. So Saudi Arabia is already the largest market in the MENA region for foreign direct investment, attracting 10.4 billion USD in 2020. So even if you think about it, even in the context of COVID-19, with reduced levels of public funding available, this still accounts for 18% of the total inward FDI to the MENA region. So this, of course, symbolizes a huge leap for Saudi in terms of its international appeal as a destination for foreign funds. The other point I would like to mention is that inwards funds are, of course, not the only significant feature of the Saudi market. You have the outward remittances from Saudi Arabia, which have been a staple feature for many years. even prior to the Vision 2030. So in the same year that inward FDI reached 10.4 billion, as I mentioned, dollars, outward remittances totaled 35 billion USD. So making KSA one of the highest sources for outward remittances in the world. So all of this activity, combined with the economic diversification, which we will be addressing, which my colleague Hisham has touched upon, will contribute to Saudi Arabia's status as a trade and financial hub, which in turn, of course, will create a more sophisticated and extensive financial system in which the criminals can try to hide illicit proceeds. So this correlation is particularly apparent when it comes to risks such as money laundering, for example. But there is also a logical connection there, and it also applies to other risks such as I said earlier, sanction evasion, but also terrorism financing and other forms of trade-based crime like fraud, corruption, and illegal trade. So I want to briefly here emphasize that just because we are talking about comparative levels of risk, even where we say that one risk is lower than another, this doesn't mean that we are talking about a risk-free market, okay? So this perception, of course, can be damaging if it leads to a more relaxed approach to compliance implementation. But I think that based on the progress we have seen and the new regulations, it all comes together with a view that really Saudi Arabia is well placed for the near future in terms of financial crime mitigation, etc.
Thank you. Just made some mentioned some very sweeping trends there, and they're certainly very relevant. I'm sure we'll be circling back to those at a later point in the session. So now that we have a broad overview of the background, I think it would be helpful for us to drill down into some of the more specific changes that are happening, so that we can look at how these are affecting businesses sort of at the practitioner level. So Hisham, the privatization law, or the private sector participation law, is due to come into effect on the 21st of July. And this is a key part of the Vision 2030 objective to increase private sector participation from 40% to 60% in Saudi Arabia by 2030. Looking at the privatization law, practically speaking, what are the key features that are going to make the most significant difference to private companies? And what sectors do you think are going to be most aggressively targeted by this process?
As you mentioned, this is one of the perhaps the major changes in the commercial law in general. I mean, this is a newly enacted law, which are expecting in 1 month from now, it will be enforced. And by the way, the implementing regulations now is published for public view on it and comments. I think the law, the privatization law, provides a wide range of regulatory control that enhance the confidence of the investors in the process of offering privatization projects. The law emphasizes about the enforcement of any privatization contract between a private party and the government, and also to ensure that any financial obligations upon the government in these projects will be addressed in the kingdom long-term budget. In my view, I mean, there are a number of things that we can discuss about the privatization law, but in my view, the main key things that I find it there, one, in terms of the risks, the law indicates that there will be distribution of risk between the government party and the private party in terms of quantity and in terms of the nature of that risk. It's also in terms of the financial obligations, whereby, for example, the private party is entitled or obliged to pay. This will be linked primarily to his level of performance of his obligations. One of the most interesting things in the law that it exempted those companies which are engaged in privatization projects from a certain provisions under other laws. Just one of the examples here, the companies law provides when a company losses exceed 50% of its share capital, the shareholders must resolve this issue as soon as possible, whether by increasing the share capital, decreasing the share capital, or commit to support the company. The privatization law provides something that this can be exempted. In addition to that, and it's a very interesting point to many of our clients and foreign investors in general, that the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development may exempt certain provisions that indicated in the labor law for those companies which are engaged in privatization projects. For example, the Saudization quota, they may exempt that in these projects. Certain provisions about termination of employment contract, the duration of employment contract. All of these, the Ministry of Human Resources has a discretion to exempt these projects from such kind of provisions. Well, in addition to all of this, unlike the current, I would say, regime or law that govern any contract between the government and any private party, which most likely will be subject to the procurement law. In the privatization law, it allows that the contract indicates be noticed by each party and against the other. So if there is a breach from the government in that contract, the private party may impose penalties in terms of that breach, which is a huge change to be precise here. And the last very interesting point here is the dispute resolution mechanism. Unlike the current laws, the privatization law provides that both parties, which is the government party and the private party, may agree to resolve their disputes via arbitration, and it is not necessarily the Saudi law will be the governing law. This, in my view, the main feature and the main features in this new law, and the implementation regulations is subject to review at this moment now, and perhaps there are other interesting points to be addressed in the near future.
Sure. Thank you, Hisham. You've highlighted some really important points there, particularly around the exemptions and the dispute resolution. I think those would be really key for companies to keep in mind when that new law does come into effect next month. So following on from that, this means we've now mentioned significant initiatives to drive both public and private funding through the economy and opening up of previously restricted sectors, which will really change the balance of public-private participation in the economy. What impact does the dual role of public spending and boosted private access to traditional state functions have on certain financial crime risks, citizen?
Well, as a general rule, where we see more frequent interaction between public and private sectors, there's usually an increase in corruption risks, okay? So particularly when we are talking about a very competitive market with large-scale projects, as we see, and high levels of public financing, the increased contact points and procurement process without strict rules in place can provide plenty of opportunities for corruption activities. So now the increase in corruption risk is not the same as saying that we will have a guaranteed increase in the rate of actual corruption offenses, because there are a lot of other factors, of course, that play into this trend. So significantly, the ability of the authorities to demonstrate a zero tolerance policy and approach, strong enforcement as well, but also a more supportive framework of robust controls that improve, to improve oversight and governance are all crucial. So Saudi Arabia has a checkered past when it comes to corruption issues and has had to take a very aggressive approach to overturn some of its historic issues that have created an enduring impression of corruption levels in the country. So now, and I'll ask my colleagues to put on the screen the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index 2020. So as you all know, this Corruption Perceptions Index is a very popular tool that is used by international investors when they assess the level of country risk for corruption factors. This is not the only one, of course, but it's one of them. Others would be, of course, the like of ease of doing business by the World Bank and all other ratings for the risks. But it is no secret, and it's a very important point I would like to make here, it is no secret that corruption indexes paint a rather negative portrait of corruption in the Middle East and North Africa region. But we also know that the methodology and the data gaps for these reference sources can be problematic in practice. So if you look at Saudi Arabia specifically, it has only 7 sources out of a possible 13 for the 2020 index. So some of the sources that have been used do not have the available data for Saudi Arabia. So for example, if you look at the World Bank country policy and institutional assessment, which is one of the 13, or the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. These two have like number of countries covered. However, they do not have the data for Saudi Arabia. So by definition, it means that if we look at the numbers again, out of 13, only 7 are available. So my point here is that it does, of course, ultimately affect the ranking. So, and it means also that some of the variables that highlight its successes are not factored in to the assessment, okay? So Saudi Arabia has demonstrated significant political will to combat corruption offenses. And in particular, I mean, the Oversight and Anti-Corruption Authority, Nazaha, has been exceptionally active in bringing criminal actions against public officials. It is actively, and I'm sure you probably receive very frequently either the SMSs or the updates from Nazaha in terms of the frequent updates that they are circulating in relation to the enforcement actions, because they regularly report hundreds of oversight visits, but also investigations, arrests in a single period. And it affects, I mean, it targets, of course, citizens, but not only citizens, also residents that are working for the government across many of the critical ministries and public bodies. So these are not all cases of petty contribution. So just to give one example here, in November 2020, Nazaha brought one of the largest cases in its recent history. And it was, I mean, they recovered 1.2 billion Saudi riyals from a total of 48 individuals from both the public and the private sector in one single case. So often in practice, when you come across instances of potential bribery, there is a common perception as well that corruption is not criminalized in the private sector, but this is not true. Saudi Arabia's bribery law has been amended to cover this. And also, if you look more at an international level, we see that the most significant penalties for corruption are levied at companies. So this is not yet the case in Saudi Arabia, but I would anticipate that it is very likely something we can expect in terms of the future legislative developments, as we know that lots of developments are actually happening to incorporate the corporate criminal liability in the near future, amongst other things.
Okay, so are there any other features of JISM in the framework that businesses tend not to be aware of that might influence their corruption, their exposure to corruption risks?
Thank you for this question. Actually, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because the other significant feature of the Saudi legal framework from an anti-corruption perspective is the exceptionally broad definition that is applied to public officials. So because of the expansive role of public funds in driving development, additional protections are granted to public funds, of course, and office to protect the integrity of the state functioning, you know. So this is particularly important given the context of the role of the public investment fund today, and the protections where they extend to private employees contracted to carry out a function of the state, or to employees of financial institutions, let's say. So on this front, it is gratifying to see how many instructions we receive seeking advice and like within the last couple of months or year maybe on gifts and hospitality practices, because this tells us and this is also highlights heightened awareness that improper conduct will not be treated lightly, you know. In addition to that, I think I would like to mention briefly, I mean, the fact that on top of the anti-bribery law, the Saudi government has brought in a raft of ancillary regulations and measures to control its interactions with the private sector. And that includes, of course, the public procurement law, which was implemented in April 2020 in relation to the conduct and ethics regulations, but also conflict of interest restrictions for public sector workers. You know, state funds are the lifeblood of Saudi Arabia's drive today to modernize. And these additional protections reflect the higher standards of accountability in governance that are requisite for effective leadership in all countries, ultimately, you know. One last point I would like to make briefly here is that overall, I mean, good governance practices are taking a more prominent place in business management, which is clear in the new structures that the government has put in place internally to organize its efforts. So this is not solely linked to corruption, but ultimately these ministries and similar company level controls implemented by savvy private businesses contribute and will continue hopefully to contribute to the integrity of the entire market in the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, for the international companies that are moving into Saudi Arabia, it's not only the KSA regulations that they need to be aware of, right?
No, absolutely not, actually. And particularly when it comes to corruption, it's very important to mention that here. Foreign laws can apply, particularly strong and far-reaching extraterritorial obligations. So if you look at the most famous instances, you look at the UK Bribery Act or the US Foreign Corruption Practices Act, FCPA. And recently, as you know, President Biden has announced an ambitious new whole of government approach to fighting corruption, which could prove to be a more successful model than the isolated efforts that are commonly implemented by most governments. This is also relevant actually because the additional emphasis on anti-corruption efforts has also led President Biden to announce an increase in funding for FCP investigations. And we know for a fact, because of the matters and the clients we represent in this part of the world, whether it's here or in other jurisdictions, that they do target, when there are FCP investigations, most of the time they also target companies that are operating in this part of the world. So sometimes companies are not aware of when they have triggered the US jurisdiction, and it's important that this is something that is looked into very closely, and this is why we have been quite busy with this type of queries actually.
Thanks, Christmas. A lot of insights on corruption there. So Hisham, I'll come back to you now. The PIF has named several sectors as priorities in the local market, and of course it has extremely prominent giga projects that have captured the attention of the world because of their scale and sheer futurism in many senses. So projections put spending at $40 billion per year on domestic projects. Many of the PIF's giga projects are already underway. So what trends have you seen for businesses on how these projects are materializing and how companies can make the most out of them?
I would like to highlight one thing about within the anti-corruption from an anti-corruption perspective. During the last 5 years, maybe I should say that during the first point that I addressed, the government transferred from being a regular physical manual way of operation to digitalizing all of the process and regulations. And so at the moment, all of our process applications and dealing with the government are digitalized. This will minimize corruption to a large extent, to a huge extent. And every application would be linked to a specific person known to the governmental authority. Anyone dealing with the file itself from the government is known to the management within that government organization. Going back to this question specifically about these giga projects, as it sounds, it's a giga project. So speaking about almost building in new cities. So the main, I would say, sector here will be construction. That's the main one. And as I was speaking with one of those seniors at one of these giga projects, he was specific saying that we have started from zero. So you're building the whole city from scratch. You need the whole infrastructure, telecommunication, and you may name it. Now, what we are expecting about of construction, I think the main other type of sector that will be focusing on this will be entertainment, tourism, and hospitality. Just as an example, and the largest, to be expected, the largest entertainment city in the region will be Al Qiddiya, which is not that far away from us here. There will be more than 10 hotels in that area. We're speaking about 360 square meters. That is the area of Al Qiddiya. It's huge. I think it has been announced it's bigger than Paris itself.
Really?
Yeah, Al Qiddiya, yes. So, and this should be open later in 2023. So yeah, that tells you, you just, the main sector will be construction, but the other also main sectors to be attracted in these cities or these giga projects are hospitality, telecommunication, all sorts of consultation, IT projects, and yeah, as it sounds, entertainment and tourism.
Thanks, Hisham. I mean, the scale of that is very, very impressive. Yeah, of course. So actually, you did mention something just now when you touched on it, Justin's point about the protections that are being put in place for anti-corruption. We have spoken quite a lot about the risks, but one of the key points that we are also picking out is what the KSA authorities have done to combat those risks. So the mutual assessment of the FATF was published in September 2018. And as most people will probably be aware already, the results were very favorable for Saudi Arabia. 2018 might seem like a very long time ago at this point, but AML reform is an ongoing process. Tissim, can you first just summarize very briefly what KSA did so well to produce those results, and also what we've seen in the time since then, since the publication of the report, that indicates where AML regulations fit in terms of priorities on the policy agenda?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, actually, overall, KSA received positive feedback from the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, in respect of its technical compliance. And out of the 40 recommendations, only 4 received the rating of partially compliant. It did not receive a rating of non-compliant for any of the recommendations. And ultimately, these ratings were or are a reflection of the continuous efforts that Saudi Arabia has undertaken to improve its legislative framework since its first FATF assessment in 2003, which was published in 2004. The 2018 report, however, is the first assessment that KSA faced using the new methodology, the new 2013 FATF review methodology. And there were more notable deficiencies encapsulated in the effectiveness assessment. So, but work never stops with the FATF assessment, of course, and there are still a lot of changes underway that expand and even strengthen the AML CTF framework. One that I want to mention in particular, because we have been asked there are lots of questions lately, is the new anti-concealment law, which has just come into force in Feb this year. So if you have read the law and if you are familiar with this law, the central purpose of the law is to prevent situations whereby non-Saudi nationals are able to engage in unauthorized economic activity by utilizing the legitimate rights of a Saudi natural or legal person. So, of course, there are strong penalties and administrative fines, etc., for breaches of this law, I mean, including up to 5 years imprisonment and fines of 5 million riyals, etc. And what is relevant here is that following the implementation of this law, the central bank of the kingdom has instructed financial institutions to create a new role. So there is someone who would be responsible for ensuring that this new anti-concealment law is applied properly. And this individual is someone that has to sit within the AML function, so that person would report to the MLRO, the money laundering officer. And the rationale behind this decision is actually threefold. First one, it's the opportunity to have a trading company that is licensed and functioning under someone else's name holds clear attraction, for money launderers. So, and in fact, is a common feature, if you think about it, of many money laundering typologies. Secondly, the AML functions are well resourced and trained to a high level in identifying suspicious indicators for money laundering activity, which has strong parallels with corporate concealment activity. And the third point is that by keeping the function within the AML system, the authorities also can in turn ensure that the suspicious reports can be submitted through the same channel. And so there is no division in the oversight and investigation system. So in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, I think that's probably the best place to start from. We are aware, of course, that KSA is pursuing an ambitious and aggressive agenda for advancement on the international stage, and that its appointment also as a member of the G20 countries and as a full member of the FATF has provided already and will continue to provide a greater platform for visibility around its national governance efforts. But simply proliferating stakeholders in the AML CTF will not be enough, to reinforce regulations or to reinforce the Saudi Arabia's technical compliance with the FATF regulations. So that's why the Saudi government has been and will need to continue to be smart about how they centralize the AML and CTF system, so that there is sufficient coordination between the relevant branches, including the regulators, the law enforcement, and the private sector. So ultimately what I'm trying to say here is that we want to be in a situation where there's no disjointed system, so that will assist, and there will be no situation where information silos would decrease the utility of the reporting, of the investigation, or the prosecution cycle even, and having actually a robust system and a robust framework for AML and CTF is not only extensive, but also effective and clearly communicated, as you would be well aware, within the kingdom, because this is vital to the kingdom's efforts to attract foreign investments and commerce to the country. So this means also that it will involve implementing the very highest standards for AML CTF practices, and also ultimately and naturally providing the additional comfort to the international community that Saudi Arabia has taken every effort to address any perceived weakness.
Yeah, thanks. I think particularly some of those points there that you've mentioned in relation to the sort of circular feedback proposition that we have, those are conversations that we're having about all of our regional jurisdictions, right? It's not only Saudi Arabia, that's an overarching theme.
Absolutely.
So it's a really important one to touch on. There's one final topic that I think we should cover before we go to audience Q&A, just if we have time. It's not necessarily one, again, that's unique to Saudi Arabia, but it's definitely, in the context of modernization of business, it is felt particularly acutely in this market. And Hisham, actually, you mentioned it very briefly earlier. I'm talking about cybercrime and fraud more generally, although in practice it's becoming harder to disseminate between them these days. Saudi Arabia has one of the highest internet penetration rates in the world, more than 93%. And correspondingly, it also has one of the highest rates in cyber attacks. But clearly, the answer here is not to reverse the digitalization process. That's counterproductive. What trends are you seeing just in cybercrime cases that show us where the greatest risks to businesses are concentrated, and what practical measures are available to mitigate them?
Thank you, Florence. So cybercrime is arguably the fastest growing area of risk for businesses operating in the Middle East region. And there has been, of course, a proliferation of cyber threats that specifically target enterprises that make up the bulk of MENA economies, and particularly within the GCC. So if you look at, let's say, family offices that control large amounts of wealth, but have relatively primitive levels of data security, they make this makes them the prime targets for cyber attacks, of course. So moreover, the private ownership structures are often accompanied by business culture that prioritize profits over expensive controls and defenses, as we know. So there was an international study that was quite interesting, because it indicated that out of all family offices and businesses, 28% have already been subject to cyber attacks, and PwC actually reported that Middle East as a region is the most vulnerable in the world to targeted cyber attacks, experiencing more frequent and larger scale threats. So if we look at now, if we dig deeper and we look at the numbers, cyber attacks are now estimated to eclipse the value of the global drug trade, reaching a predicted annual value of more than $6 trillion per year as of this year. Wow. So yeah, and KSA had 7 million cyber attacks in just the first 2 months of 2021. And because remember, now we are in this phase where we have been, mostly working from home. The remote working protocols have been actually targeted, And the same report published by Kaspersky said that 20.5 million brute force attacks against remote desktop protocols happened in 2020. So by this, I mean, it's about guessing the corporate employee login details and credentials, And of course, as a result of the remote working, the risks are higher. The other thing is that the majority of the attacks that we see our clients are being subject to in KSA involve really fairly simplistic methodology, involving mostly phishing emails or fraud schemes whereby the criminals will assume the false identities online to solicit transfer of funds. And KSA is a particularly attractive market to these schemes, as criminals often pose as representatives of, wealthy local families or high net worth individuals, or even institutions targeting international businesses that are not necessarily familiar with this part of the world and claiming to offer investment services. So in the context of what we see happening and the willingness to bring more like investors, etc., of course, people do get tricked with this. So if we are quantifying, I mean, the cost of cybercrime is not just a rudimentary exercise in totaling the value of money actually siphoned through during attacks. As subject to the methodology of the attacks, other assets may also be targeted, and data is actually an exceptionally valuable asset for many companies, which may be damaged or destroyed during an attack, or like you have seen some increase in terms of ransomware as well. Intellectual property and trade secrets may also be stolen, and theft of personal and financial data may be stolen, leaving the victims vulnerable to further attacks along the way. So even once the primary attack has been committed, there's still something that needs to be highlighted here, which is the subsequent disruption caused to normal business. So to the operation, to forensic investigation, etc., and restoration also of hacked systems, because it might be something that is extremely difficult, but also we need to mention here the reputational harm that may be caused if the knowledge of the attack is leaked to the wider market, let's say. So in some situations, the reputational damage caused to a company by failing to prevent actually a cyber attack could constitute an extension level event by itself. So in other words, even relatively routine cyber attacks can pose an existential threat to a business. And as a result of that, some businesses may have no choice but to close down. So part of the problem in defending against cybercrime is raising awareness and ensuring also that people are cognizant of the type and level of protection that is needed in modern business practices to protect commerce. So simultaneously, the awareness needs to be reinforced also with an effective legislative framework involving not only criminal provisions, but also, supporting standards and policies that are capable of acting as guidance for companies in protecting themselves against contemporary cyber threats. And as we know, things have been moving quite fast, so it is relevant for everyone to keep up with all the changes. And if you look at the Saudi Arabia cybersecurity framework, it was announced by the Communications and Information Technology Commission, CITC, in May 2021, this year, and it imposes exactly the kind of cybersecurity requirements and controls that are required to offset this risk that I mentioned, including the risk management methodology, but also specific measures for service providers to be able to deal with cyber threats effectively. On a more, and I will stop here probably, on a more basic level, from my experience, some of the most effective protection can be brought by simple measures such as password hygiene training for employees, as it is usually, mostly human error or lack of vigilance that can create the openings for cyber attacks.
Exactly. So the phenomenon you mentioned about increased risks generated by the remote working model, that's global in nature. You mentioned the Kaspersky report, which puts the worldwide figure of brute force attacks against RDPs at 3.56 billion with the transition to remote working, which is a staggering figure. So this type of activity and the schemes that have exploited similar gaps in the system created by the kind of wrenching change to compliance and operating models, that's become known in financial crime circles as COVID fraud, right?
Yeah.
So typically there's a lot more attention on regulated entities being targeted by financial crime because of their role in safeguarding the economy. But COVID fraud is far less discriminate in companies that can be targeted. What operations have been most vulnerable to COVID fraud, and what typologies have you seen that are most relevant to the Saudi market?
Well, so as you said, COVID fraud as a phenomenon is so called because of the vulnerabilities that were created by the remote working process, okay, which brought ultimately lack of direct oversight, of course, because we work from home, etc., and a lot of somehow bypass protocols with emergency authorizations to respond to emergency situations, of course, and of course the technological elements. So naturally, we have seen that process-heavy industries with invoice-intensive operations were amongst the most significantly affected by this trend for a very simple reason, but due to the additional strain that was placed on the supply chain during the pandemic restrictions. So this is very relevant for Saudi Arabia due to the strategic significance that has been placed on manufacturing, industrial and healthcare sectors under Vision 2030, which are especially vulnerable to this type of fraud. So a potential useful exercise for companies that found themselves particularly financially damaged by the pandemic might be to take a closer look at whether losses incurred were purely driven by the pandemic or actually were in fact a result of internal fraud by employees taking advantage of reduced oversight during the pandemic. Because we have seen, we have been assisting many of our clients where internal fraud has been identified actually.
Sure, thank you for that. Now I know we've run to time, so unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to many of the Q&As. Thank you, Joanna, for sending these through to me. I'm going to have to cherry pick, but there is one point I think that we should address because several people have actually mentioned it. And unsurprisingly, that is the new requirements for businesses to establish their regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia. So do either of you, or both of you, have any information about the full extent of the requirements in relation to this?
Yeah,
I'll start? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Hisham. So, as everyone would know, January 2021, at the fourth FIIF, the outline of the project was presented and was revealed to require basically companies to establish regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia by 2024 as a prerequisite for access to state-backed contracts. So, of course, the most relevant sectors one would have in mind talking about this will be those directly related, I would say, to Vision 2030 projects, so energy, construction, of course, tourism, travel, renewable energy, and engineering, to name a few. And we know that, of course, the Ministry of Investment has yet to set the details of the project, including what would be actually the regulatory requirements, what would be the exemptions and the incentives. At the moment, we know that there are probably less than 5% of regional headquarters that are based in Riyadh, although reports indicate that several large companies have already committed to making the move. But in practice, of course, what I would say is, and of course, subject to Hisham's additional comments, there's no way to officially indicate on company documents where the headquarters are established, you know, and what is simply a branch, which makes compliance virtually impossible for now. So future designation could be tied to details such as, for example, the tax registration details or the volume of trade and the employee locations probably. So the current service providers for government entities are likely to be the most concerned by this new requirement at this stage. But again, time will tell. It's still early and we are waiting to hear from the Ministry of Investment.
Yeah, I agree with what you mentioned, Sam. I think, and to add to this point specifically, I think the most affected sectors for this resolution will be the consultation. I mean, unlike other sectors, most other sectors, the implementation of any deal with the government has to be done on the ground here. Consultation sometimes does not necessarily you have to be on the ground. You may just fly in and then fly out. So I think this type of arrangements will be so effective. As the resolution indicated, this only relate to the deals with the government. So the private sector shall not be affected by this by no means. So I think as Sam mentioned, the criteria of what does headquarter means is still, we are waiting for more information about this. I think, in my view, the most important criteria here that any contract will be implemented with the government will be implemented in KSA must be done by someone or by those who has a proper resident permit in Saudi,
Mhm.
as opposed to stop this fly in and fly out. And the ultimate goal is to transfer the know-how and provide more training for the Saudi youth.
Thank you very much, both of you, for that. So unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our time today. Thank you, Ibtisam and Hisham, both, for sharing your insights with us. I know we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but if you do still have any burning queries, please do feel free to contact any of us. We have recorded the session, so if you want to revisit any of the points that we discussed here today, then let us know and we'll be very happy to share that link with you. Or equally, if you'd like to share that with your own contacts. Ibtisam, Hisham, any last lines that you want to say?
And no, actually, I mean, thank you very much, Florence and Hisham, and thank you all for joining us today. And actually, I mean, really, we look forward to meeting you in person in the kingdom and elsewhere, of course, where applicable. But and we are so excited with all the development, the changes, the things we have been seeing happening within the kingdom, and we are really pleased to be part to those developments and looking forward to working with all of you in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, Florence, for moderating this webinar, and thanks to Ibtisam for the valuable information. And thanks for everyone attending our webinar. I hope you find it useful, and hopefully we'll be in touch.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
it from us. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Assalamu, bye, bye.
Assalamu.